This last November, thousands gathered from around the world in Glasgow, Scotland, for the COP26 Climate Summit. While the usual promises about emissions reductions and renewable energy were made, accompanied by around 500 fossil fuel lobbyists, an interesting talking point was brought to the public's attention. This is the idea of climate justice. It's an argument based on the idea that wealthy, developed countries owe a debt to developing countries due to centuries of unchecked pollution. Tens of thousands of people took to the street, demanding some sort of action on what is, by nature, a highly controversial topic for many. The next few years could see these terms being used frequently in serious climate mitigation strategies. But how did this idea develop? And what are the facts behind it? The climate debt argument has been around for decades, but was made popular by Bolivian representatives at the Copenhagen Summit in 2009. The argument begins by treating the Earth's atmosphere as a common pool resource. This means that it's a resource that everyone can use, but is easily overused, like a fishery that gets overfished. In this case, the atmosphere is a storage site for carbon dioxide emissions that is rapidly reaching max capacity. In order to stop this overuse, policies funding renewable energy projects or carbon dioxide removal must be implemented worldwide. The main question, as it often is in economics, is who should pay for all this? Supporters of climate justice think that the all-time biggest polluters, like America, China, and other wealthy nations, should front the majority of this cost. This means not only paying for their own emissions reductions, but also those in other countries. While this may seem unfair at face value, this idea has some potential looking back in history. One argument is that wealthy nations should front the cost of reducing emissions since they built their current wealth upon pollution that continues to this day. The energy used, infrastructure built, and jobs created over the last 2 centuries would not have been possible without irresponsibly burning tons and tons of fossil fuels. This is why many believe that wealthy nations should not only focus on being carbon neutral, but making themselves carbon negative through carbon capture strategies. This way, there's more space in the atmosphere to accommodate extra carbon dioxide from poorer countries, giving them extra time to develop their economies the way wealthier countries already have. A second argument is that poorer nations are owed a debt since the damages associated with climate change will disproportionately fall on them. The very nations who contributed the least to climate change are already seeing some of the worst effects. In May 2020, Cyclone Amphan struck eastern India and Bangladesh, causing over $13 billion in damages, making it the most costly cyclone in the North Indian Ocean. In November 2020, Hurricanes Eta and Iota ravaged Central America in an unusually long hurricane season, causing serious damages to Nicaragua, Honduras, and Guatemala. And in Kenya, heavy flooding in 2019, followed by severe drought, has led to locust swarms larger than anything seen in almost a century, leading to extreme food insecurity. Worse still is the fate of low-lying island nations like the Maldives, Kiribati, and Tuvalu, which will be mostly underwater by 2100 if oceans continue to rise as they are. This is not to say that wealthy nations are immune to climate change disasters, as they are not. However, these nations have a stronger infrastructure to mitigate damages and recover much quicker. Poorer nations do not have the necessary funds to brush off waves of intensified natural disasters. To put this into perspective, the 10 nations with the worst food insecurity have generated a mere 0.08% of global CO2. To let these nations be even worse off due to the pollution of the wealthiest nations is simply immoral. Despite the ethical arguments as to why a climate debt may be owed to these poorer nations, it becomes more uncertain when trying to determine what action should be taken. Some opponents argue that redistributive policies for atmospheric pollution is ridiculous, as the world was ignorant of the greenhouse effect while the CO2 was being emitted. Ignorance does not always excuse actions, however, especially when the consequences are global and will affect the futures of billions. This also does not take into account the carbon still being emitted into the atmosphere today with total knowledge of its harmful effects. Another issue for policymakers is that of intergenerational responsibility. The people who would be held responsible are not the ones who emitted a majority of the carbon, but their descendants. This is where many opponents draw a parallel to racial reparations, believing that people today should not have to pay a set amount for the mistakes of the past. It can often be hard to put a dollar value to things like oppression and injustice, making legislation difficult to pass. But the aspect that sets climate debt apart is the fact that carbon in the atmosphere can be objectively measured and traced back 200 years. By using this as a precise measure of how much countries have contributed to climate change, it helps make climate debt policies more feasible. But how would these policies work? One easy and realistically terrible idea to pay a climate debt is for the biggest polluting nations to just pay out a set amount of money. This is clearly not the best option, as the money can easily go to corrupt sources and end up doing more harm than good. A better option would be to fund renewable energy projects in developing countries to help lower their future emissions. This way they could further their development without having to rely on more readily available fossil fuels for construction and electricity. This is a more feasible option, as it's easier to observe if the money has been spent where it was intended. A third option could be to spend the money locally on the advancement of carbon sinks. This could be achieved through artificial means such as carbon capture and sequestration, or natural means like reforestation and soil restoration. By pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere, it buys developing countries more time to switch to renewables. These options would help alleviate some of the damages that climate change will inevitably cause poorer countries, helping humanity collectively endure this massive challenge. For better or worse, the likelihood of serious climate debt policies being passed currently is close to zero. Right now, the concept is not a high priority for nations focused on lowering their individual emissions or grappling with misinformation campaigns and political corruption.
So it's very, very cold out, very unseasonal.
It also requires an effective international governing body with the power to hold nations accountable for their promises. However, this doesn't mean discussing climate debt is fruitless, as it's a conversation that cannot be avoided in the decades to come. As a warmer planet fuels more intense disasters and disrupts predictable climate patterns, there will be a need for humanitarian aid for the nations most affected. Whether or not this aid comes from a global climate debt fund is still yet to be decided. One thing is certain, climate change isn't stopping anytime soon, so it's up to us to decide what steps must be taken to avoid the worst outcomes. Thanks for sticking around to the end. Let us know in the comments what you thought of the video and whether or not you agree with the points we brought up. Subscribe, share, and leave a like if you enjoyed the video. I'll see you next time.